So just hit record button there. So this meeting's been recorded. So good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's Trasna na Tíre lecture. This evening, we're thrilled to be joined by Patricia Byrne, who has written a brilliant account of Edward Nangle and what's known locally in Achill as the Achill Mission or the Achill Colony. So this lecture links in well with Finola Finlay's recent lecture for us here in Trasna na Tíre entitled Saints and Supers, which covers similar events in West Cork. Patricia, you're very welcome to Trasna na Tíre.
Thank you very much, Liam, and good evening, everybody. Thank you all for joining me, and a particular welcome to the people of Achill. I know many of you are joining tonight, and indeed the Achill diaspora. I know that many of you will have listened to Finola Finlay's fine talk last week, and we've touched base by phone, Finola and I, and you will see many similarities, particularly in how the Achill Mission and the West Cork Superism episode were linked to the Second Reformation in Ulster. Edward Nangle's colony has been fiercely contested in the Great Famine years and down through the years ever since he set foot in Achill in the 1830s. This was particularly intensive in the Great Famine years with charges of superism, but it continued through to the 1850s and to land agitation, and indeed it continued through to the present day. So then this is the story that I'm going to walk you through, the Achill Mission story, which spanned almost half a century from the 1830s through to Edward Nangle's death in 1883, even though at that stage it was very much in decline. So this then is the book that I've written about the Achill colony, The Preacher and the Prelate, and people are always interested in how I got involved in this story. I was actually born in Mayo, but not in Achill. I was born about 30 miles from Achill in East Mayo. And about over a decade ago, I became interested in Achill stories. In fact, my first story that I wrote was about the Valley House and the James Lynch Hahn episode that might be known to some of you. And then some years ago, I attended a Heinrich Böll Arts Weekend in Muilin. Heinrich Böll was a Nobel laureate writer who came to Achill in the 1850s, and he had a cottage in Achill, which is now an artist's residence, which actually is located very close to the remains of the colony. And at that weekend, there was a presentation on the Achill colony, a very balanced presentation. What I was unprepared for, and I think most people there were unprepared for, is after the presentation, there was a most acrimonious debate about the Achill Mission colony. There was a fierce argument between those who claimed that Edward Nangle had brought everything good to Achill. He had brought education, he had brought land reclamation, he had brought famine relief, he had brought medical services, he had brought tourism, all of which are very good. But then those who felt that really he had brought a sectarian divide, that he had brought, particularly in the famine years, where all of those who gained relief, many of them converted from faith to Protestantism, and that he had empathy really for the people or their culture or their folklore. So I realized at that weekend that the Achill Mission colony had left a residue of hurt and bitterness and trauma that survives to the present day. This fascinated me, and I remember writing in my prologue, I wrote, "I am hooked by the story. I decide to retrace these Achill Mission colony events, to walk the places where they were played out, to search the archives, and to listen to the stories handed down by the people." So the places were very much the places in Achill, at Dugurt and at Muilin, but also Arva and Cavan, where Edward Nangle spent some time. His burial place in Dean's Grange, and Screen, County Sligo, where he ended up as a curate for considerable time. This then is the place where the Achill mission story was played out. This is Achill, I'm sure known to a lot of you, the shape of an upside down boot, it's often called. I think Robert Lloyd Prager's, the botanist who the naturalist who visited Achill at the end of the 19th century, I think his description is very good. Achill windswept and heavily peat covered, with great gaunt mountains rising here and there, and a wild coast hammered by the Atlantic waves on all sides, but the east has a strange charm which everyone feels, but no one can fully explain. So almost like a saucer, mainly bogland in the center, and then those fabulous mountains, Slievemore, Crahan, the Minnan Mountains, all around, almost like in the shape of a saucer. Many people nowadays go to Achill. They arrive at Achill through the Western Greenway, which has been built on the old railway line from Westport through Newport to Mulranny, and will soon be extended right in from Achill Sound, right into the island itself. It's 15 miles from east to west, 11 miles from north to south. Nowadays, most people would be familiar with Kiel as the main tourist area, and also Kent, beach at the extreme west end of the island. But our story takes place in North Achill, around Slievemore Mountain, which dominates the northern coastland, and particularly around Dugurt, which was the base for the Achill mission. In the 1930s, it was called the most destitute spot in Ireland, Achill, synonymous with poverty, backwardness, ignorance, and almost savagery in some places described as such. Edward Nangle spoke of ignorance and barbarism, intellectual and moral degradation on the island. And here is where he came, Edward Nangle came in 1831. So what is it? Just to summarize what it is. It was an evangelical colony with the aim of converting the people of Achill by an evangelical clergyman. It grew out of the Second Reformation across the whole belt of southern Ulster, led by the clergyman, Edward Nangle, spanned 19th century, almost a half a century from the 1830s through to the 1880s, attracted controversy, not just in the Great Famine years, but also through its education, through its schools, and also through land. It's as if all three of these became intertwined in the controversy at Achill. And very much based and rooted in the evangelicalism of, as I mentioned, Ulster. So the phases of the Achill Mission Colony. Edward Nangle arrived in 1831 as a very young clergyman, married with small children. He first came in 1831, but then came back with his family in 1834. And those years, the 1830s, through really until the famine years, they were exemplified by education and schools and fierce conflict and competition, and a fierce personal acrimony between John McHale, Archbishop of Tuam, and Edward Nangle. The 1840s brought the Great Famine, and of course this was really where the emotive charges of superism that Edward Nangle offered, not just food in the schools, but also relief, all sorts of relief and employment to those who were willing to convert from Catholicism to his church. But the 1850s, in my view, the 1850s was almost the most dramatic, because it was the time the Achill Mission actually became a landlord. And this was, I found this almost the most extraordinary period. in writing about the Achill Mission story. And then you had the 1860s, where there was almost an internal implosion within the Achill Mission, and particularly the trustees who had been appointed after they bought the land. A lot of disagreement as to what the Achill Mission was about. And this continued for almost a decade. And then the Irish Church Act in 1870, where it was not longer necessary to pay tithes to the established church. This and the Land Acts led to the demise of the Achill Mission through the 70s. And by the time Edward Nangle died, it was little spoken of, I suppose. Its great days had passed. So Edward Nangle, he was born in 1800, and he trained as a clergyman in Trinity. And in the 1820s, he went north. And this church is Arva in County Cavan, a few miles from Cavan town. And it's here that the young clergyman was based. His background, he was actually of a mixed religion family, unbelievably. His mother, who was Protestant, died when he was young. His father remarried and remarried a Catholic. But I think the trauma of his mother's death had a very deep effect on him. In his early 20s, we had the beginnings of ill health, physical and mental and emotional ill health. And this would stay with him for most of his life, and certainly during the period that he was in Achill. It was almost as if he had periods of almost manic energy and hyperactivity, and he had enormous output, as we will see, in terms of his activity. And this could be followed by total collapse, where he could be out of action for several months at the time. And the beginnings of this started when he was very feverish around the whole evangelical campaign that was going along in Ulster at the time. He was very close to Cavan and very close to the Farnham estate. If any of you have ever visited the Radisson Hotel in Cavan, that is the seat of, that was the house which was the Farnham estate. And Lord Farnham, John Maxwell Barry, had taken over the estate in the 1820s, and he was imbued with this whole Second Reformation evangelical Protestant movement, which was sweeping across Ulster. And essentially the thinking behind this Reformation was that the root of a lot of Ireland's problems lay with what was termed popery, with the Catholic Church, and that the peasants, the deep bad plight of the peasants could be greatly improved by converting them to the Reformed faith. It was during this time that this Second Reformation, where the evangelical movement became closely linked with landlordism, which obviously happened in the case of Lord Farnham. And the belief was that the tenants and the peasants could be converted if they could be trained with a moral education, trained in the scriptures, trained to lead a better life, and so on, that this would lead to a better life for themselves, but also a better returns for the landlord. So this document on the right, in 1920 or 1827, a very large meeting presided over by Lord Farnham was held in Cavan, and they decided to launch the Cavan Association for promoting the Reformation. So it was as if Cavan became the epic center of this movement, very much launched by Lord Farnham. The interesting thing, and obviously Edward Nangle was close by and observing all of this, and the interesting thing was that the template that Lord Farnham had, I mean, he sent communications to his tenants. He wanted them to have proper housing, 2-story houses, whitewashed inside and out, a garden in the vegetable garden in the front, and so on. And we'll see when we come to the Achill Mission, this was almost replicated by Edward Nangle in Achill. Now, if the Farnham estate gave him his template, the intellectual foundations of his vision came from two, and he cited both of these men in talking about the impetus that both of them gave him in coming up with the vision for his estate. The first one was on the right, William Krause. Now, William Krause was an Englishman, but he was recruited by Lord Farnham to be his moral agent. So this was where the moral agent on the estate was charged with the scriptural education, with the moral education and the whole moral improvement of the tenants. And included in that was conversion. And at this time, there were many public recantations where Catholics publicly changed their religion to be part of this movement. Edward Nangle met William Krause and was very, very taken by him and by his movement and what he was doing. William Krause is said, Farnham's system is altogether new in this country, and the eyes of all of Ireland are upon it. So it was as if this was the whole epicenter, as I mentioned, for a whole movement. William Krause influenced Edward Nangle, as did a Scottish Baptist minister called Christopher Anderson. And he wrote this book, The Historical Sketches of the Native Irish. He had done a lot of work in Scotland, in the Highlands and in the islands. And he had come to Ireland and studied and gone and visited the islands. And he basically believed that enlightenment and the reformed religion should be brought to the native Irish through the medium of their own language, the Irish language. And Edward Nangle adopted this. At least he adopted some of the language aspects and had the Bible translated. So here was, at this stage, it was during these years, he was so enveloped in the fever around this Second Reformation in Cavan that his health totally collapsed. And for about 2 years, he was ill. It was during this time that he met the Adams family in Athboy, and particularly Dr. Neeson Adams, a medical doctor, and his wife Isabella. And they brought him to their home in Dublin and helped him to recuperate. It was also during these years that he met his wife, Eliza Warner, from County Meath, and they married. So he had his template, he had his vision, he had his intellectual foundations. In 1831, when he was married with one little girl and Eliza was pregnant, he and Eliza came on a relief mission because, of course, there was famine in the early 1830s, particularly in the West. And in 1831, he came on a mission on a relief ship to bring provisions to the west of Ireland. He travelled by horse to Achill because he had heard about Achill, and he spent several days in Achill, and he went to Slievemore, this mountain, this dominant mountain, and he persuaded Sir Richard O'Donnell, who was the landlord for the area, to give him some land. So he made the decision on that trip that this was where he would establish his colony. However, it wasn't until 1834, but between 1831 and 1834, he was assembling the land. Construction began on housing. He was assembling his team. So by the time he arrived in 1834, the basic infrastructure and houses were already in place, and he was able to hit the ground running. So he arrived at Dugurt Strand, this strand here, on the 1st of August, 1834, with all of the family's belongings, and Eliza and their 3 young daughters, Frances, Henrietta, and Tilly, all aged under 5. They arrived in this absolutely desolate spot. There wasn't, their buildings were the only slated house on the island at that time. On the right, the image on the right is the deserted village. It's on the other flank, a few miles from the colony. It's on the western flank of Slievemore. It's become iconic as a sort of symbol of the devastation or the desolation that followed the Achill period. It's about a mile of roofless cottages spread along the mountain. It was actually here, a few months after his arrival, that Edward Nangle, because it was a village, thriving village at the time, Edward Nangle established his first school. It seems to me, always seems to me quite a coincidence that in the year that the Nangle family arrived in Achill, John McHale, who was born around the same time and died within a few years of Edward Nangle, John McHale was elevated as Archbishop of Tuam, and Achill was within his jurisdiction. Now, the pair had met in the 1820s when Edward Nangle was a clergyman in Ballina, and John McHale was there as well. I've no evidence that they ever met, but actually their spat with one another started even before 1834. But in 1834, it really intensified. I'm always amazed too at the many similarities between John McHale and Edward Nangle. Born within a few years of one another, both lost their mothers while young. Both had enormous gifts for oratory and preaching and writing. Both had extremely strong organization ability. But what came through from both of them is that fiery polemic and invective, particularly towards one another, and that continued over about 4 decades between the pair of them. The Archbishop MacHale visited because he was strung into action by the fact that Edward Nangle was establishing schools in Achill. There was a thirst for education. There had been no schools apart from the hedge schools. So John McHale was strung into action and began visiting Achill. And there's a very dramatic scene I recount in my book of John McHale with his entourage addressing a congregation at Ducanella near the Minone Cliffs. If any of you have walked the magnificent Keene Beach to the end of the beach, you're under the Minone Cliffs. And there John McHale addressed his audience. And you can look across, he was able to look across the island at Slievemore Mountain where the colony was based. And he's reported to have said, "There is no place outside of hell," he thundered, "which more enrages the Almighty than the Achill colony." So this was typical of the type of speech between the two of them on both sides. So in the 1830s, education was the battleground for the Achill mission. This image here, it's a woodcut of the colony, and it's taken from John Barrow's book, A Tour Around Ireland from 1836. And you will see the L shape, the 2-story houses. Now later on, these 2-story houses would become interspersed with single stories, an unusual design. You will see the neat walled gardens out in front, and the cultivated fields going right up into the mountains, into Slievemore. And what you get is an impression of order within the colony against the backdrop of the wild Slievemore Mountains and the surrounding area, or as it was called at the time, an oasis of civilization. And a lot of this infrastructure was put in place in the early 1830s. In 1831, the Stanley Letter had announced a scheme for non-denominational primary education in Ireland, which seems amazing to us at this juncture, seeing as denominational education persisted in Ireland right for so long, right up to the present day. And neither John McHale nor Edward Nangle agreed with the Stanley scheme. Both of them were of the view that education should imbue and infiltrate the whole system of education. Once the Achill Mission started to set up its schools, John McHale started to set up rival schools. But he did it in a very wily, clever way. He took funds from the national scheme meant for denominational or non-denominational education and used these supports to set up his own very denominational schools. And there were numerous complaints, particularly by Edward Nangle. So what you got was an explosion of schools across Achill. Where there had been no schools, you now had an explosion of schools. And it was particularly in the scriptural schools established by the Achill Mission that the practice of feeding the children in the famine years took place, a practice which, not surprisingly, gave rise to an avalanche in demand for entry to those colony schools from people who wanted their children to get food. Some of the sort of sectarian strife and warfare, particularly led by John McHale and Edward Nangle, it's exemplified in, I suppose, this. This is a quote from Edward Nangle: "Is it a wafer or is it a god?" And we find in the Achill Missionary Herald, that we'll come to in a moment, that transubstantiation, or the practice, or the Eucharist, which is central to Catholic beliefs, this became a particular target of Edward Nangle's. And this he published in the Protestant Penny magazine. He published an article which he headed "Transubstantiation Disproved by a Mouse." And this was the Council of Trent, and it shows a clergy and a servant, a mouse attacking a wafer, and the clergyman and his servant trying to kill the mouse, which referred to a Council of Trent edict. Lady Jane Franklin visited Achill in 1835, the year after the Nangle family arrived. And she said of this, "I cannot but deplore that Mr. Nangle should think it right to speak as he does of a doctrine, the Eucharist, which, however erroneous and to us incredible, is held in pious awe by many an honest Catholic." And there was an extraordinary, in 1835 or 36, there was an extraordinary meeting in the courthouse in Castlebar with both sides discussing this issue. There were several hundred people, this issue of transubstantiation, and Edward Nangle in attendance. So this was part of the sectarian rhetoric of the time. In 1837, Edward Nangle launched the Achill Missionary Herald newspaper. It was a monthly newspaper, and you can see here the masthead had the image of the colony on it. It was an extraordinary initiative. For over 30 years, Edward Nangle personally edited and provided most of the content for it. Within 2 years, it had a circulation of about 3,000. It's a very rich primary archival source. When I was writing my book, I spent many long hours going through originals of this in the National Library and in Trinity College Library. While an awful lot of it was made up of obtuse doctrinal discussion, there is also a rich amount of information on local goings-on, local activities in Achill, and insights into the main happenings of the period from the 1830s through to the 1850s. The writer Kevin Toulis has described it because it was an enormous fundraising tool for Edward Nangle. He's described it as like running a Christian tele-evangelical TV channel from the depths of the Amazon. So really extraordinary, and there are some great images or great narratives in the Achill Mission of the parts for the printing press be brought in by boat to Dugard Bay, and then being brought up to the colony, and the printing press being established on the colony, and up to 3,000 issues being sent all over Ireland and all over England. It was a promotion tool, it was a fundraising tool, and it promoted Edward Nangle's story about the Achill mission. So the 1830s, this is a watercolor of Eliza Nangle and her two eldest daughters. Now, Edward Nangle produced many watercolors himself, and Hilary Tulloch has done amazing work in compiling all of his watercolors and linking them to various locations in Achill. We're unsure if this one was actually painted, this portrait was actually painted by Edward himself. We're not sure. What we are sure is that Eliza Nangle, the family arrived with, as I said, 3 daughters under 5. In the next 3 years, in the 3 years after they arrived, she had a pregnancy each year, and each of the infants that she gave birth to, they died fairly close after birth. So they were the 3 years, and she was under enormous stress. Her health was already in serious decline, not helped by Edward's absences, often for several months, on his preaching and fundraising trips in Ireland and in England. After she lost her third son in 3 years, she wrote, "We have only one surviving written document from Eliza, while we have hundreds of thousands of written words from her husband." But she wrote a letter after the death of her third child. "I often find my heart swelling with sorrow and my eyes filling with tears that I cannot restrain. I trust I may become purified and made more ready for the kingdom of Christ, with whom our 3 dead infants abide forever. Edward has been much spared in this owing to his absence from home." So this was very much a feature of her life, and it was a life of a terrible hardship, even while she contributed to the work and to the bookkeeping activities. She did a lot of the bookkeeping for the colony. It was a time of crisis when she wrote this letter, and their friends in Dublin, Dr. Neeson and Isabella Adams, they came to Achill. They responded to the crisis that the family was having, and they remained. They gave up their practice. He gave up his practice in Dublin. He joined the Achill colony, and they were childless, but for the next 20 years, they really supported the Nangle family. But particularly during the famine years, he became the man about whom the folklore said he was a good man. He was very well thought of for his efforts during the famine years. The 1830s was also a time when a lot of visitors came to Achill, because what Edward Nangle was doing, it was something that people felt was a great initiative. I've mentioned the Franklins, Samuel and Anne-Marie Hall, the writers, and later in the famine years, Asenath Nicholson and many more all came to see this experiment for themselves. So by the 1840s, the Achill mission was at its zenith. We can see here the single-story houses interspersed with the 2-story houses. In fact, the second house on the top left-hand corner, that was where the printing press was located. The central building along the top row of houses became the Schlievemore Hotel and the beginnings of tourism in Achill and in the colony. So it was at its zenith. Edward Nangle gave evidence at the Devon Commission, and it was clear that already, even before the famine years, he was turning his attention to acquiring more land, and he was beginning to see land as a real tool and vehicle of his colony, land where he could bring people particularly people who converted from outside the island, from within the island. They were offered pieces of land and also housing, and they were also given incentives to reclaim the land and so on. So he was already, from the Devon Commission, turning his attention to land. He had already acquired from the O'Donnell estate an additional site at Muillin, and he had done some, I suppose, quite blatant things. He had established a priest's asylum for priests, and he was beginning to persuade priests, Catholic priests, to convert, and that was quite a prominent thing. And also he had begun, he hadn't done this in the 1830s, but in the 1840s, before the famine broke, he had begun the practice of public recantations, which he had observed on the Farnham estate, where people made a public declaration that they were changing their religion. And he introduced this practice, but he discontinued it in the early years of the famine, I suppose, accepting that it wasn't something that sat easily in the famine years. So it was at its zenith in the early 1840s. This is a watercolor of Muillin that Edward Nangle produced. In Muillin is a site on the other side of the island, on the west side. He established, similar to what he had established in Dugart, but he also established almost a seminary, a training area for the scripture readers and the clergy and so on. So it was another move on from what he had done in Dugart. This started, he acquired the land before the famine, and a lot of the infrastructure was actually put in place during the famine years. If you go to Muillin nowadays, there's actually hardly anything left, unlike the Dugart site, where all the main buildings are still intact. None of the buildings, very little except ruins of these buildings, are still intact in Muillin. Now we come to the famine years, the 1845, 1846. This is an oil on canvas cottage, Achill Island, by Alexander Williams. It was actually painted after the famine. It has Slieve Moor in the background, Slieve Moor, where the colony was based. And it's kind of an iconic painting that very much conveys the desolation and the decline, not just of Achill, but of the country after the famine years. When the famine struck in 1845, 1846, Edward Nangle blamed it on the government's support for the Catholic seminary in Maynooth, which he described as the fountainhead of popery. It was, he said, God's judgment. It was God's judgment on the government and the people. Yet Edward Nangle had such a strong organization in place that he was able to get a huge organizational response in terms of infrastructure, relief works, land reclamation, school buildings, and fundraising, because of the organization structure that he had put in place in Achill. The issue that was raised and continues to be raised, and we'll talk in a moment about it, did Edward Nangle and his colony save many from certain famine death through all his relief efforts? Or did the colony exploit a vulnerable people by bribing them to convert through material and food benefits, in particular by feeding the children in the colony schools? So this became an issue even during the famine itself. People talk about Edward Nangle saying that it was God being angry that delivered the famine, but a lot of clergy, John McHale would have expressed sentiments not too dissimilar to this. Edward Nangle's words, surely God is angry with the land. The potatoes would not have rotted unless he sent the rot into them. God is good, and because he is, he never sends a scourge on his creatures unless they deserve it. We have undertaken to feed all the children who have been in attendance at our schools during this scarcity. One thing I was totally surprised by was that Edward Nangle, as he often did in a time of stress, totally collapsed at the end of 1845, beginning of 1846. In fact, he was away on a fundraising trip and he collapsed and he didn't come back to Achill and to his home for several months. In fact, Eliza was pregnant, her health was deteriorating, and finally he was persuaded to return after Eliza gave birth to another stillborn child in March of 1846. However, his fundraising continued and the organization was in place to continue the work. Children began to be fed in the Achill Mission schools, and obviously this led to a huge demand for places in those schools. It led to a huge building program around mission schools because people wanted their children to be fed. Dr. Neeson Adams, on the other hand, who provided medical services and so on, and these were said to have been delivered equally to Catholic and Protestant community. During the famine years, the Achill Mission's income was recorded at £6,000, extraordinary at the height of its fundraising. This was through fundraising, collections, donations, and also through its own income. But the charges of superism emerged. It was during the famine years, this is Asenath Nicholson, the American philanthropist on our left. These are 3 books, if anybody interested, they're all in print. Maureen Murphy has edited them and they are a wonderful read. The Atlas, the Atlas of the Great Irish Famine, has described Asenath Nicholson, her testimony during the famine, as the most vivid and the most firsthand and the most empathy, because she literally traveled around the whole country, oftentimes on foot, stayed with people in their cottages and cabins. She had many things in common with Edward Nangle: a love of the Bible. She was an evangelical Protestant, a passionate belief in education, a desire to improve the living conditions of the people. So she wanted, from the very beginning, she wanted to visit the colony, and she did so twice. She did so before the famine, and she did so at the height of the famine. Her verdict on the Achill Mission was harsh. She expressed her surprise and disappointment that the mission appeared to prioritize the teaching of the Bible over basic literacy. So while they appeared to learn the Bible, they didn't have the basic literary skills. She was extremely upset by what she termed the lack of courtesy and hospitality, which was very basic to her. And she particularly objected to the colony, what she described as bribing the people away from the faith of their birth. She has a lovely scene where she speaks to the children in Achill, and she describes their light-hearted reaction when they told her, we are going back to our own chapel and our own religion when the stir-about times are over and when the potatoes come in again. So that was Asenath Nicholson, and she writes quite a good deal in her book about the colony. Did the Achill Mission save lives during the famine? This is often debated back and forth. We do know it has been difficult to estimate deaths during the famine, but there is a consensus that County Mayo had the highest excess death rate in the 1841-1851 decade. In terms of population, Achill's population declined by just under 1,000 in that decade. It's interesting that the decline in the Achill population, and obviously the population declined as a result of deaths, but also emigration. It's interesting that the population decline in Achill was 18% compared to 27% in County Mayo and 20% in the rest of the country. So obviously the decline in population in Achill was less, a good bit less than Mayo and less than the average throughout the country. Melanie Gibbon, in her PhD thesis, has done really very interesting research on this population change. And she found that the that in Dugurt and Muilen and Shraheens, which is near to where you access the island, the population increased in the decade. So obviously Dugurt and Muilen and the Achill colony were certainly a factor. What we don't know is because people from the island of Achill moved to the colony, but people from outside moved in. They moved into the orphanage, they moved into the asylum, they moved to get land and cottages. And we don't know what the numbers are there, but it certainly is reasonable to assume that lives were saved by the Achill mission, lives within Achill and lives outside Achill through its famine relief work. And Maliniki Bunn's analysis probably helps that. Just talking about the family and Eliza's decline, we see that the first three children, the three girls arrived with them in 1834. The three infant boys that they lost from 1835, 37, all buried in Achill. Then Eliza had three more children between 1839 and 1844. But in the famine years, 1846, at the height of the famine, 1846, while Edward was away, and again in 1847, two more children died, all six of the children buried on Slieve Moor. And after 1846, the family essentially moved to Dublin, while Neeson Adams still remained with his wife in Achill. After a very long illness, Eliza Nangle died in Dublin on the 19th of June, 1850. She left 6 children living, 3 adult daughters and 3 young sons. And this is her death notice that appears in the Achill Herald. And this, on the right-hand side, is the plaque erected to her memory, which can be seen in St. Thomas's Church in Dugurt. Achill had broken her health and her spirit, even as she conscientiously undertook the family and mission work in a dedicated way. So she was also brought back to Achill. So this is the resting place of Eliza Nangle and 6 of her children in the Shanrelig on the slopes of Slieve Moor. Her body was brought back, and in her obituary it said that she was quite a large congregation attended her funeral in Achill. Shortly afterwards, in 1852, Edward Nangle was appointed as rector of Screen, County Sligo, where he spent over 20 years, so he left Achill. He continued to edit the Achill Herald, and he continued to be the main public face of the Achill colony. He came back every year for a month's holiday. He also remarried his second wife, Sarah. And the next phase of the Achill colony started, which is really about land. But the Nangle family at this stage, Edward is in Screen, Eliza has died, the children are in Dublin. So the Nangle family is no longer resident in Achill, even though Edward is very much still the figurehead. This is the Achill colony from a different angle. On the right, you're not able to read it, but it's an announcement in 1852 that the announcement by Edward Nangle, our trustees are now in possession of 3/5 of Achill Island, and an agent has been appointed to receive the rents of the estate. The Achill Mission is now the major landowner and landlord on the island of Achill, because it has purchased land from the encumbered estates court, the lands of Sir Richard O'Donnell. His claim is that it is to ensure the self-sufficiency of the colony, particularly where John McHale is interested in buying land. And it was an enormous achievement to raise the funding to buy the land. Now, he did sell off some of the land, and some of it ended up in the ownership of others, but still over half of the island was now held and owned by the Achill Mission. So now you get religion entwined with land in the next phase, a very interesting phase of the Achill colony. This is Bunacurry Monastery. John McHale now sought to play the colony at its own game. He purchased lands at Bunacurry on the main road from the Achill Sound towards Kiel. The remains, that central photograph is a picture of what remains of the Bunacurry Monastery. He invited the Franciscan monks to set up a monastery there, and he adopted a model very similar to the colony. He established a school. The Franciscan friars got involved in land reclamation. They provided employment. So it was like a mini Achill colony. John McHale also resumed his provocative visits to Achill, and he began to hold ceremonies to receive back into the church those who had converted in the famine years, almost like a recantation ceremony of his own. The remains of the Bunacurry Monastery still remain. If you listen to Sunday Miscellany, you will often hear John F. Dean talk about going to school there when there was a primary school. There was no longer a primary school. It's now being developed into a heritage centre. So in 1855, always his dream, Edward Nangle had raised the funny, had got a substantial donation, and he built St. Thomas's Church across the road from the colony, looking straight up at Schlievemore Mountain. Inside, many plaques that commemorate the Achill mission times. He'd received a substantial donation, but issues would arise over the next decade. There would be a lot of issues about the running costs and the clergy stipends and the use of the Achill estate monies. It's still operating as a Church of Ireland presence, and actually it's open most days. Anytime you go to Achill, anytime I went to Achill, it was opened and you could visit St. Thomas's. A few months after that, Isabella Adams died, 20 years after arriving with her husband, and niece and Adams left shortly afterwards. And people would say about the Adams couple that they were almost the essential glue that held a lot of the moral fabric of the Achill Mission Colony through their medical services and through their work on behalf of the poor and the destitute in Achill. During the 1850s, Achill was transformed. Nowadays, you'd probably describe it as the construction crane phenomenon. Such was the development work and the construction underway. And you must remember that apart from the Achill Mission and the Coast Guard Station, there were no slated houses in Achill. It was really an island of very basic cottages. But after Achill Mission acquired, now over half after it sold off some of the land, William Pike became the second largest landowner on the island. And he built a very large house at Treheens, just as you cross over into the island. The Catholic Church were building the monastery and all the buildings associated with Bunacurry. St. Thomas's Church was completed. Captain Boycott, the infamous Captain Boycott, took a sublease on some of the Achill Mission land at that beautiful spot at Kem. And if any of you have been over to Kem Beach and have walked up towards the Croghan slopes, you will see the remnants of Captain Boycott's house. A very interesting, Alexander Hector came from Scotland, and he took a lease from the Achill Mission on the Ireland shorelands, and he set up an amazing processing facility on the island. And tourism began to be developed, even though it would be the 1860s before the railroad arrived to Westport. So there was an explosion of development. And you might almost say it should have been a golden age for Achill. However, it coincided with huge acrimony over land. Land with William Pike on his estate, and there was a notorious in the folklore, they talk about the alt evictions, the evictions at Christmas, where William Pike, because there was a whole movement to amass, to get larger holdings together and less smaller holdings held by tenants. So enormous physical development, but also a lot of acrimony over land in the 1850s. This is a map of the Achill Mission from the Ordnance Survey series, 1897 to 1913. It shows the extent of the Achill Mission, the church and the rectory on the right-hand side, the main buildings like a little village, the constabulary, the medical services, the schools, the hotels, the post office in the main colony itself. I mentioned that in the folklore refers to the Achill Mission driving out the people from the land. Just to quote one of those, to the old people, the land of Slieve Moor was like a blessed place. They had their houses and their living and their graveyard and everything else, and everything was taken off them. So this was the folklore that built up. But I suppose we have to remember that evictions were part and parcel of what was going on across the country, particularly in Mayo, where you had the highest number of these. And all landlords were trying to get larger tracts of land, and they didn't want a lot of the smaller tenants. In terms of land with the Achill Mission, it had acquired its early lands directly from Sir Richard O'Donnell. After it became a landlord itself in 1850-51, obviously they were able to control the leases of the land, the Achill Mission directly. But land became entwined very much in the Achill Mission story in these years. Tourism, Edward Nangle was always interested in tourism, and from the 1840s there was a hotel, one hotel. You ended up with several hotels in Dugart. And here, these below, the two images below were two postcards. You can see the Temperance Bar there, two postcards. So already the tourists were beginning, and it was north, it was where the colony was. And obviously this was became much stronger once the railway came in 1860s. And of course, the railway eventually came to Achill at the end of the century. But already there was a power struggle beginning in Achill, what I call in the 1860s, an internal implosion, because you had trustees in the Achill Mission, and they were embarrassed by the public criticism of the state of the tenants of the Achill Mission. It almost became a classic stakeholder struggle for whose benefit was the Achill Mission and the Achill Mission estate. And some of the trustees thought that more of the income should be spent in improving the conditions of the tenants. Whereas I suppose Edward Nangle had a view that he had to use it for the church and the missionary activity and the schools. So it became quite strong, and eventually went on for almost a decade. And it really consumed a lot of the energies of the Achill Mission. And then by 1870, the Irish Church Act, whereby the tithes, the church, the established church, could no longer get tithes from all of the people for the running of the churches. So there was really a very fast decline of the Achill Mission in the 70s. And by the time of Edward Nangle's death in 1883, he was largely unknown. He died in Dublin. He's buried with his second wife, Sarah, in Deansgrange Cemetery, while Eliza and 6 of their children are buried over 200 miles away on the slopes of Slieve Moor. And this is the plaque immediately after his death. There was a plaque erected to him in St. Thomas's Church. And soon afterwards, in 1884, Henry Siddall produced a biography of Nangle, which has a lot of good first-hand material. It was produced quite quickly. This is the obituary, and I suppose already you can see the divergence of views about Edward Nangle and the mission. The Church Advocate, which had grown out of the Achill Missionary Herald and the evangelical background, they were positive. Few clergymen of the Church of Ireland were better known or more highly valued in his day. He won praise for his bold and uncompromising exposure of the errors of Rome and Catholicism, and for his ardent evangelicalism. The Irish Ecclesiastical Gazette, which I suppose would have been more mainstream Protestant church, said Edward Nangle was a perfect example of the rugged, uncompromising cleric who fought the battle again with weapons of his own choosing, when a gentler campaign might well have been better and more permanent. So you can actually see a kind of divergence of views at his death. There continues to be a divergence of views on Edward Nangle and the Achill Mission. Melanie Gibbon, the historian, she has spoken and said that the efforts of Nangle and his fellow missionaries to endeavor to alleviate the worst features of the famine by importing grain and providing work and feeding the children has to be commended, even if the motives were not straightforward. And undoubtedly, as we have said, lives were saved as a result of Edward Nangle's activities during the Great Famine. On the other side of the scales, Desmond Bowen has argued that the colony represented cultural and religious imperialism, an attempt to change the peasant culture of the people into an English way of life, or in Edward Nangle's own words, or in his own words, to civilize a barbarian people. It's a legacy that continues to be debated and contested. The Achill itself, the Achill community came to terms with the legacy of the Achill mission in its own way. A decade ago, in 2011, the Protestant and Catholic communities under their bishops came together for a memorial and healing service at St. Thomas's Church. There were about 190 graves identified in Achill mission cemeteries, which were unmarked, and crosses were placed on each of these graves. And the wording of the booklet of the ceremony, I think, were chosen very carefully. Some Achill people buried here had become Church of Ireland members, inspired by the Reverend Edward Nangle and his community. It is probable that others lying here, who likewise changed denomination or were linked closely with the mission, would have lived and died in the Roman Catholic community had the times not been so desperate materially and polarized spiritually. There were high feelings of anxiety, hurt, and anger about both groups for many years, and a mix of anger and admiration about the mission's work and methods. So you can see the effort from both communities around the legacy of the Achill mission. When I was finished researching and writing this book, and before I wrote the epilogue, I climbed Slievemore, which is not an easy challenge by any means. And I reflected on the journey I had been through personally in following the Achill mission story. And I tried to capture this in what I wrote in the epilogue. And here was some of what I wrote at the time. The great Irish 19th century conflicts around education, religion, imperialism, and land were fought out on this island. Responses to the Great Famine seared and divided a community. The Achill mission story is at the heart of these events, a microcosm of a bitter history. So it was as if, to me, as if our 19th century Irish history, it was expressed in a microcosm in Achill, but with great intensity and in very vivid colors through the story of the Achill mission colony. Thank you, that completes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much now, Mrs. Byrne. That was brilliant. Very, very good talk now. So I'm just going to fill in for our Liam here. I think his internet is down at the minute. Okay. So there's a few questions for you.
Okay.
If you don't mind answering them.
No.
So the first one here is,
Hello?
Hi, Patricia. I've just lost my Wi-Fi there. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you, Liam.
Yep. Okay. I'm just going to try and get into the Q&A here. So the first one is from Fiona Sweeney. My great-great-grandfather, William McNally in Dugart, was part of the colony. Do you know anything about where?
Yes, I did come across McNally's as being part of the colony. I just cannot recall, certainly the name rings a bell, but I cannot actually recall the context. Maybe I could look that up. I'm just not able to recall the context. Whether he was whether he was a clergy, I just don't know the context, but I do certainly remember coming across McNally's in my research.
That's great. Thanks, Patricia. Another one from Vincent Finnegan. Who owned the land that MacHale bought for the teaching of the Catholic children through the Franciscans?
It wasn't part of the O'Donnell estate, it was part of another estate. And he acquired a much smaller block of land, much smaller than the colony, but it wasn't part of Sir Richard O'Donnell's. It was another estate, another landlord in the island at the time.
I think Liam must be gone there. Oh, he's back again. Let him take over again.
No, if you want to go ahead, Stephen, because I'm having a lot of Wi-Fi problems here. Apologies for that. So if you can do the Q&A, that'd be great.
Get on. Okay, Maria, was there a link between the work of Michael Brannigan in Ballinglen Mission School, Presbyterian Church in Castle, County Mayo, and the work of Nangle?
I'm sorry, I never came across that connection. It doesn't, I mean, obviously there were other colonies throughout the country, like in West Cork and like in Dingle, and also there was one in Connemara. They're the ones that Edward Nangle's, the Achill colony was by far the largest and the most extensive, but I'm not familiar with that one.
Okay, many thanks. There's Joan O'Keefe has a question here for you. Do you have any information on the Nangle schools found in other Achill villages, e.g. Cloughmore and Byrne at the time?
Most of the information I picked up from the schools was from the Achill Missionary Herald, and also Melanie Gibbon has a lot in her PhD thesis, has a lot of material on the schools, on their location and on the numbers, and for instance on the fact that there were about twice as many boys as girls attending the schools. So that's where I got most of my information on the schools, but they were quite extensive in the 1830s.
Okay, thank you very much. How significant was Captain Francis Reynolds as a supporter of AM, even though married to Margaret Doherty from Mallinhead?
Yeah, I didn't actually mention, there's a whole story in Captain Reynolds. He was Coast Guard, he was a Protestant, he was the head of the Coast Guard in Achill. He was a supporter of the colony. He was a very divisive figure. His wife was a Catholic and was a practicing Catholic on the island at the time, which made it very uncomfortable for her. He was attacked in quite a vicious attack, 1837. After several weeks, he died. On the night of the great wind, it was an extraordinary story. He was buried on Slieve Moor, the same graveyard where Eliza Nangle is buried. And they had to exhume his body to do a post-mortem. And he was buried. And that night, the great wind, the famous great wind, erupted over Achill, and they actually call it Iha Reynolds in Achill. So he was quite a controversial figure. They had 7 or 8 children. The whole family was split up after his death. She went back to Donegal. The children, a lot of them emigrated to Canada. So So a divisive figure, great supportive of the mission, his wife a practicing Catholic, a very difficult situation, and a very dramatic story around his death associated with the big wind.
So they actually call that night after McReynolds? Or
Yes, in Achill they call it Iha. It's known in some places as Reynolds. Yeah.
Dead on. One here from Mary Jane. Was superism common around Ireland during the famine? I am familiar with it in southwest Cork also.
Yes, I mentioned, I mean, the ones that I'm aware of are obviously, Finola spoke about West Cork, and also in Dingle, and also to a certain extent in Connemara. So there were pockets around the country and in other places as well. But Edward Nangle's was really the dominant one because of the scale of it, and because obviously it was well established before the famine hit. And because he himself, because I suppose of the Achill Missionary Herald, because of his own big personality and his lecturing and his preaching and so on, and also because of the whole spat between himself and particularly John McHale. So all that gave it a prominence, I suppose, that the others didn't have.
Yeah, I think one of my relatives, Merrion Press, and she went out to the west and certainly went around Belfast and gathered up money for the soup kitchens and all that there, you know. But another question here, Brian Talk, thank you so much. First of all, I'm curious, what did they serve in the temperance bar?
What? I don't. Those postcards I think are from the end of the century, and I suppose temperance. I didn't mention this in connection with Achill Nicholson, but certainly from Lord Farnham's and William Krause and Edward Nangle and Achill Nicholson, a big part of their moral education was sobriety. And trying to take people off alcohol. So it was a big part of the mission. And that's why you had the temperance bar. And in fact, Achill Nicholson herself was an enormous supporter of the whole sobriety effort. So the temperance bar isn't surprising because it was very much part of the ethos.
Dead on. Another one here. Would you say that sectarianism was equally divided? That is, was it as bad coming from Catholics afterwards as it was at the time from Protestants?
Well, certainly in terms of the spat between John McHale and Edward Nangle, I'd say it was equal, and the language and the vitriol and so on was equal on both sides. And in fact, it would have started in the 1820s. And Edward McHale would actually have gone to Cavan objecting to what was going on in the Farnham estate. So it was very deeply entrenched. So I think at a certain level, it was equal on both sides. I suppose where it became an issue would have been around the schools and around feeding the children in the schools and linking the famine relief to being part of a conversion effort. I suppose that's where it became more controversial.
Dead on. Okay, according to the last census, do you know what the percentage split between the various religious groups?
In Achill?
Yeah, I assume so.
Oh, I don't have it, but I mean, the population of Achill now is it was about 5,000 before the famine. It's about 2,500 now. The Church of Ireland community is very, very small in Achill at the moment.
Okay.
This church is open for services every 2 weeks, but it's a very small congregation, and it's served from Westport. There isn't actually a clergy.
Okay.
I mean, maybe there is. Sorry, I'm unsure about that, but it's a small community in Achill.
Dead on. Another one here from Debbie. Did Nangle continue his colony into Innisbiggle?
Yes, in the late 1830s, he acquired his initial land, but then he acquired more land from Sir Richard O'Donnell to expand, and he acquired land on Innisbiggle. And if you go to Innisbiggle, there was a small church erected there. So he acquired that land from Sir Richard O'Donnell and extended it, the same sort of model, into Inishbigel. And I've been there and visited the church that was built there. So yes, yes, he did.
Dead on, thank you. Was Neeson Adams a religious man? It would seem that both Neeson and Isabella were mostly concerned with helping the poor Achill and not in converting them.
Well, he was a medical doctor. He responded when he first met, he seemed to have befriended Edward and Eliza when Edward was very vulnerable and had this total collapse, total breakdown, which lasted for about 2 years. And it wouldn't take, they thought he wouldn't survive. And they nurtured him back to health. So, I mean, he was Protestant. His body was taken back, their bodies were taken back to Kilbride, and there's a plaque to them both up in Kilbride. But I suppose what comes across in everything that I was able to read about him, he seemed to concentrate, both he and Isabella, first of all on his medical services, but also on collecting funds to clothe people who didn't have clothing, and on the whole relief effort. I have no evidence of him becoming embroiled in any way in the sectarian activity. Now, they did that for 20 years, plus it was as if they adopted Eliza and her children as their own family because of the crisis that they endured. So I have no, and in the folklore, they talk about Neeson Adams as a good man, inverted commas. So certainly in the folklore, he has remained as somebody who helped people.
I'm sorry, carrying on from that there. I'm noticing a lot of doctors back then would have went to the likes of the University of Glasgow, which was a theology college. And I'm wondering, maybe, did he go to something like that there?
I'm not aware that he did. I don't think so, but and I'm not aware that he did. It was a personal relationship that he and Isabella had with Edward and Eliza and their children. And I think there was a strong desire to support them. They realized that the family needed support, particularly Eliza. And I think that was a strong element. And then during the famine, I think there was a strong element of helping the people, particularly with medical services.
Dead on. Going on here, was the mission considered a success during and after its life by the Presbyterian Church?
I just don't know the answer to that. I suspect it was like with everybody, there was a balance on both sides. You know, like the people who visited the colony in the 1830s, they felt this was the answer. This was the template: bring education, reclaim the land, improve the housing, and so on. You know, it was a development template, and that it could only be good, including Asset and Nicholson, all those people who visited. I suppose as time went on, it was influenced by Edward's own almost over-the-top personality in terms of some of the issues. And then during the famine, obviously people, I haven't seen anybody that didn't admit that probably lives were saved during the famine as a result of their activities, which has to be a good, but perhaps at a cost in terms of the methods that were used. In terms of the land, that was part of a wider thing that was going on with landlords, but in ways I found that it almost led, it caused almost more bitterness than what happened during the famine years in a certain way. So how people have different views. I think there are differing views as to the relative merits and so on of the Achill mission. And I've tried to capture that.
Okay, thank you. One here from Bernard. What was the end of the AM? Did it just fizzle out after the death of Nangle?
It was, yeah, and it was acquired by the Congested District Board, like all the other estates, like a lot of estates throughout the country. At the end of the century, it was acquired, and a lot of the land was divided up among the people. So it ended up in the Congested Districts Board.
Okay, Dylan, thank you. Mary Boyd wants to know, what was the nature of his work in screen?
he was the rector in Screen. He was the clergyman. And actually, it's interesting to me, after he left in 1852, his wife had died, but after he left Achill, he seemed calmer. He remarried. No, he was still involved. If you read the Achill Missionary Herald during the years while he was in Screen, little has changed in terms of his doctrinal approach and his views and so on. But he seemed calmer, his health was better. He was still involved in the whole controversy in the 1860s and the whole kind of implosion with the other trustees. But he was the regular clergyman in charge of the parish, Church of Ireland parish in Screen for over 20 years.
Very good. Dead on. There's an interesting one here. Do you know how many people Nangle managed to convert?
Well, I just don't have the figures here, but one of the, I think it ran into hundreds, and I didn't put it in my notes, but at the end of the famine, 1849, I think, the Protestant bishop came for a confirmation ceremony, and there were 400 confirmations on Achill, and the bulk of those were people who had converted during the famine years. So there were certainly hundreds, but a lot of those came back to the Catholic Church because there was a huge campaign mounted by Archbishop John McHale and Father Henry and others. So a lot of them would come back after the famine years. And there was also a lot of emigration by people who had converted as well. Perhaps life wasn't very comfortable or whatever, but it certainly ran into hundreds.
Okay, thank you very much. Judy Kelly has a question for you. Why did Nangle leave to go to Screen?
Sorry?
Why did Nangle leave to go to Screen?
I think he was sent, you know, the authorities in the Protestant church assigned him there. Now, one could surmise that perhaps people were unhappy with what had happened during the famine years. Perhaps they felt that it was a change needed in terms of what he was done, but he was actually assigned there by the Church of Ireland authorities.
Okay, thank you very much, Sam. I think that's it for the questions. Anyway, I can't see any more. I'll just scroll down here a minute. No, I think that's the end of it. There's a lot of positive comments saying your research is brilliant and presentation excellent, very good. Many people saying thank you very much for coming on, you know. And maybe Liam can come on now and close if his internet's any use. Maybe. Maybe it's not.
Maybe just one final word, Stephen.
Go ahead.
Just encourage you to visit Achill. And a lot of the places I've spoken about, you can actually visit the deserted village, the colony. They have walking tours there. You might be able to avail of them. St. Thomas's Church, the Valley House, and the monastery. So you could have a great day of activity visiting a lot of these places once COVID leaves us.
Well, I've never been myself, and to be honest with you, you put me in the notion of going or visiting anyway. You know, I'm looking forward to it now. You know, but thank you very much for coming on there, Patricia. That was very, very good of you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for joining in. Stay safe.
So that's really it for Trasnatira tonight. Thank you very much for everybody for tuning in tonight, and a special, very good thanks to Patricia Byrne. And if you can never get her wee book there, I think it's going to be brilliant. I'll certainly get it myself in the next few weeks anyway. Okay, thank you very much. Good night.
Bye-bye now.
All the best. Take care.